Okay, so we are doing learning unit 2. It's development and post-development. Assessment 2. It says discuss the post-development theory and its critique of development. Discuss the criticisms leveled against PDT by mainstream development discourse.
Hello? Oh.
My computer's frozen.
Oh, okay.
Hi. Okay. So, can you hear me?
I can. Yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect. Let me just admit somebody quickly.
Oh God, this document is refusing to open.
Please mute your mic. Please mute your mic.
Sorry.
Perfect. Okay, so now we're going back to this. So in order for us to have done really well in this assessment 2 question, it tells us the generative summary of how we're supposed to have answered this question is it tells us that this question had 2 parts. And then we had to firstly explain what post-development theory was, and then we had to explain how it critiques development, right? That was the first part of the assignment. The second part of the assignment would have been to discuss criticisms against post-development from the mainstream development theorists. So in order for somebody to have gotten a distinction, they needed to show a deep understanding of post-development concepts using authors such as Escobar, Esteva, Petersa, Zia, and other people's authors. And then have some critical thinking. So how you would have had to structure is you would have had to define development and then introduce post-development theory, and then tell us what your essay will cover. That's your introduction. And then in the first section of your essay, you would have had to basically use some key points, such as maybe speak about what it argues against, so we said that you had to define it. So in the study guide, it tells us that it's a radical rejection of development. It's there in the beginning, like the first paragraph. And then some of the key things we would have had to speak about was its Eurocentric discourse, and that it was a project of modernization and westernization, and it was a form of power and control and a way of creating needs and dependence. And then we would have to use the different authors whilst we were explaining, and then we give examples of where it was applicable and what had happened. So for example, in Escobar, you would describe it like development as a discourse. And Esteva, maybe you would have said it's an unburied corpse. So they say every time you show a theory in an essay, you must also give examples. Close some files here because my computer is going to start freezing. Let me just close files so that my computers don't freeze. Please give me a second. So, okay, perfect. Let me just clear my screen. Okay. So that my computer can work optimally. Okay, so basically, then there's the post-development critique of development, which is the other section of the assessment that would have had to be discussing the 4 claims by Petersa, where you could basically share development represents poverty, how development was tied to westernization, and how development was embedded.
Sorry, Vui, are you sharing something? I can't see anything.
Oh, okay.
Oh, is it just me?
Let me go back to my screen. Can you guys see the screen? Can you see the screen?
No.
Okay, fine. Let me stop sharing again. Let me just Let me just reshare my screen. Let me know when you can see the screen, please. Can you see it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I was saying that in the essay, on the second part, the section 2, there are 4 claims that were listed by Pieterse in this post-development chapter, of which it told us that development misrepresents poverty. People are defined as lacking. Development is tied to westernization. Development is embedded in modernism, science, and progress, and development functions as an ideological discourse. So it tells us that we need to continually add authors to strengthen this critique. You know, another distinction tip is don't only just mention critiques, also offer alternative visions, you know, and they are found in articles like the Commons, they are found in the grassroots autonomous movements. You just have to become clear once I get into the lesson and I break it down. Okay, so the other part of the assessment too was to criticize against post-development. So we had to basically point all the critiques that were pointed. Some of them were essentializing development, romanticizing local cultures, lack of alternatives, anti-modern, anti-managerial, which was telling us that it rejects science, planning, and institutions, and a risk of authoritarianism, which tells us that local elites may oppress others using cultures, and that they say that it was not scalable. Then ZIA 2004 had two, I'm not gonna call it strands, I'm gonna say it was 2 theories, which was the neo-populist post-development and the skeptical post-development. And then you'd have to have mentioned that in the assessment too. And then, then you concluded. So I'm not gonna read what makes a thing. Now I'm gonna go to the master table. The master table now is gonna make everything easy for you guys to understand. So basically, this section here, section 8, tells us what post-development theory is. So in the textbook, it tells us the definition that it is a radical rejection of development as a whole. Its institutions, discourse, logic, and aims. It seeks alternatives to development, not alternative development. Then the foundational authors for PD theory is Escobar, Esteva, all of them, they all reject the modernist Western project, right? The origins of PDT that emerged from disillusionment with development failures in the global South, which was influenced by Illich and Foucault's discourse. You need to find that in one of the articles if you're going to mention this thing, because if you take it straight, you generalize it and you plagiarize it. And then the core claims, development misrepresents poverty, so that's critiquing, right? Development is entangled with westernization. Development promotes modernism, scientism, progress ideology. Development functions as an ideological discourse. That is in the study guide. It tells you. And then what does post-development theory reject? It rejects state-led development, market-led development, alternative development, universal models, Western modernity, notion of progress and modernization. And then what does post-development theory focus on? It focuses on local knowledge, indigenous cultures, small-scale autonomy, grassroots movements, plural pathways, cultural diversity. And then you'd have to mention from the ZIA article, I think you should go to ZIA article so that you can understand these 2 strands that they talk about. The skeptical post-development theory, which is anti-universalist, against essentialists, and supports radical democracy. The neo-populist post-development theory romanticizes tradition and it rejects modernity completely. And then post-development's critique of development. What does post-development attack? Okay, so it says development as a discourse. Escobar tells us that development is a Eurocentric discourse that constructs the third world as backward and in need of Western intervention. And another critique is that development is a failure, and then development is a malignant myth. Decades of development have worsened inequality, poverty, and dependency. So post-development is actually against development. Development says that it's too westernized. They say that PDT says that development imposes Western values, consumption science, linear progress, and nation-state models. PDT attacks development and says that development as power and domination, that it is development equals power and knowledge apparatus that governs disciplines and shapes subjects. Development as economization, it converts culture into a market logic and it replaces social relations with capitalist rationality. And development as violence. Nandi states that development is violence. Development legitimizes displacement, resource extraction, forced modernization, and expert-driven interventions. And then development as homogenization. They say that it erases cultural diversity, imposes Western universality, all societies placed on one timeline. So now we move on to the post-development alternatives, or the alternatives to development. They say that grassroots autonomy, what this means is that it's communities who self-organize without state or market control. They give an example, the Zapatistas. Then they talk about the commons in the Esteva article, which is shared community managed resources and relationships and non-capitalist economies. They also mention a cultural plurality, that there's no universal blueprint and each society defines its own good life. And then they speak about the local knowledge. So we're still talking about the PDF alternatives, that indigenous knowledge as valid as scientific Western knowledge. And then they speak of radical democracy, which is decentralization of power, deep participation, rejection of technocratic governments. Now we move on to the next section, which is the criticisms of post-development, which comes from the mainstream development discourse. The criticism is romanticization of traditional societies. Keeley mentions it, and they say that PDT idealizes local communities as harmonious, ignoring patriarchy, class hierarchy, conflict, and inequality. And then they criticize the cultural relativism, which is rejecting universal rights, risks, justifying harmful practices, example, oppression of women. And then they discuss paternalism. They say that post-development theory critics say authors impose simple living ideals from privileged academic positions. Ladies and gentlemen, this information, sorry, is from all the different sources, okay? The ones that we were required to read for the assessment. So it's about from 4 authors or 5. But you see the author's name in brackets anyways. But the reason why some of these names you don't see from the study guide is because they're coming from the articles. Okay, so the other one is no viable alternatives. Peter's 99 critique without construction. This is explained that PDT offers no scalable policy alternatives and it promotes resistance, but not institutional change. And then it tells us that it's anti-science and anti-modernity. It means that it rejects technology, science, planning, and it's seen as unrealistic. And then they talk about methodological problems. It overgeneralizes, misuse discourse analysis, and treats development as monolithic. Another criticism is it ignores agency of the South. They explain that Southern actors did not reject development. They strategically appropriated development to gain power. And then the other one was reactionary dangers, where they explained that neo-populist PDT risks authoritarianism by promoting cultural purity and rejecting democracy. So the article by Zia tells us about the bureaus and the ghosts. So it tells us that there was a premature Bureau of Development. The summary is that development still exists. ODA flows, development institutions thrive, global middle class desires development. Ghost of development in post-development theory. PDT also uses development's polysemic nature and critiques multiple things under one term. They speak about the premature burial, new published, Bon Viva and Ubuntu echo PD ideas. And then the ghost of PDT in mainstream development, they say critics now adopt PD arguments, which is Eurocentrism, power, hegemony, discourse analysis. And then they speak about a convergence where both critics and supporters now focus on empowering marginalized groups. So this table, I'm happy to screenshot it and send it to the group. Yeah, so now we're going to before we get into learning unit 2, because we're not going to focus too much because the table did everything. I'm going to skip a lot of sections, but this is what learning unit 2 is about. Like the whole analysis, it's explained nicely. So introduction, why post-development? Learning unit 2 addresses a major shift that occurred in development thinking, especially among scholars and activists from Global South. By the late 20th century, many began to feel that development had failed to deliver what it promised, which was better living conditions, reduced poverty, empowerment, or fairness. According to the study guide, post-development grew out of this disillusionment resulting from the combined forces of capitalism and development. In other words, development did not uplift poor communities the way it was supposed to. Instead, it often acted as a tool of capitalism, pushing poor societies deeper into markets they did not choose. The idea of progress became tied to Western values, consumption, technology, and economic growth. Communities in the global South began questioning whether development was helping them or harming them. Thus, post-development was born as a radical critique of the entire development project. Now, we also learn about what is post-development. Post-development is a radical rejection of the whole development system. Your study guide clearly states that post-development is a radical rejection of the whole of development, its institutions, language, and objectives. This is important. Post-development does not argue that development should be improved. Instead, it argues that development itself is a problem. So Peter Starr's article that states why reject development. Post-development, it tells us that there's 4 major claims. That development misrepresents poverty, development portrays people as poor, backward, or underdeveloped, and it denies their knowledge, cultures, and ways of life. The other claim is development is tied to westernization. This study guide says development is entangled with different forms of westernization. Western lifestyles become the model for the entire world. The third claim is that modernism and science act as power structures. Modern science, technology, and ideas of progress are not neutral. They often suppress local knowledge. Development works as an ideology. The final claim. Development isn't just a policy. It is a belief system that gets everyone to accept Western norms as normal. So the outcome. Post-development says the entire development enterprise is discredited, oppressive, and misleading. The key thinkers and texts in post-development. Your study guide lists several influential works in this field. These texts shaped the movement by exposing the hidden power relations inside development. Wolfgang Sachs talks about the Development Dictionary. a groundbreaking book arguing that development concepts like poverty, progress, growth are Eurocentric and harmful. And then Escobar, in his book, Encountering Development, Escobar shows how development turned the global south into an object for Western control. He argues that development created abnormalities like hunger or illiteracy that it later claims to fix. And then Gustavo Esteva and Madhu Prakash and grassroots postmodernism tells us that they argue for local cultural alternatives to Western development and celebrate grassroots ways of living. Gustavo Esteva, in his article Commoning in the New Society, tells us Esteva argues for commoning, which is community-led ways of sharing resources without markets or the state. He says development has been a war against the commons. And then we have Ranema and Botry. In the article, The Post-Development Reader, they tell us that it's a compilation of essays that reject the global development agenda and explore alternatives rooted in culture and community. These texts do not propose better development, they propose living without development. Now, what does post-development advocate? This is a return to local autonomy, culture, and community. According to the study guide, post-development support traditional and local ways of life, just as they are and as they decide to be. It believes people in communities should shape their own futures outside the development framework without Western experts intervening. The main themes are local knowledge over scientific expertise. Community knowledge is valuable, legitimate, and sufficient. Western science is not the only or best form of knowledge. Plurality of good lives. There is no single path to progress. People have different ideas of what a good life is. Autonomy and self-determination. People must be free to choose their ways of living, managing land, organizing economy, etc. Commons and community economies. Instead of markets, people share resources, support each other, and practice communal living. And then resistant to globalization and capitalism. Post-development rejects systems that turn human relationships into economic transactions. Now, the criticisms of post-development. Your study guide provides multiple critiques by authors like Gasper, Petersen, and Skuurman. It oversimplifies development. That's the first critique. Critics say post-development treats development as if it is one unified bad thing, ignoring its diversity. 2, it repeats the mistake of modernization theory. It essentializes development just as modernization theory essentialized progress. 3, it lacks practical alternatives. Post-development criticizes everything, but does not clearly show how to build equitable systems. It is anti-managerial and focuses on resistance, not emancipation. It rejects institutions, but doesn't provide workable strategies for real change. The other one is risk of romanticizing tradition. Some post-development thinkers idealize indigenous or traditional communities without acknowledging oppression within them. The other one is it could support authoritarian local elites. If outsiders cannot criticize in the name of universal rights, local elites may use culture to maintain domination, and then it's not scalable. Post-development works well locally, but does not explain how to manage national issues such as infrastructure, climate change, health systems. So Zia's contribution is that there's 2 types of post-developments. Your study guide cites Adam Zia 2004, who clarifies that not all post-development is the same. So this is their post-development is neo-populist post-development. They say that it romanticizes traditional societies, it rejects modernity completely, and it can support patriarchal or conservative values. The other one is it risks being authoritarian. And then they mention skeptical post-development, which they say is more useful. It critically examines development. It promotes radical democracy, and it emphasizes decentralization, pluralism, and self-determination. It also rejects universal blueprints. Zia argues that skeptical post-development shares the goal of radical democracy, which challenges elite power, empower marginalized groups, decentralize decision-making, rejects one-size-fits-all development models. Zia, in the article of 2015, The Development and Post-Development Both Wanted, tells us that this study guide also discusses Zia, who argues that both sides are buried each other too soon. So development is not dead, right? That is saying that aid still flows, development ideas are still shaping the global policy, and that many people still desire Western lifestyles. Then the other one is post-development is not dead. Many scholars still use its arguments. PD critiques have influenced mainstream development theory. It tells us that both sides need each other. Zia suggests that they must work together to fight global inequality and achieve a good life for all in a non-Eurocentric and non-authoritarian manner. Overall, the conclusion of Learning Unit 2. Learning Unit 2 presents a rich critical reflection on the nature of development. The key takeaways are that development is not neutral. It carries Western values, ideologies, and power structures. Post-development offers a bold critique. It exposes development failures and pushes us to rethink what progress means. Keys to post-development are autonomy, cultural difference, local knowledge, commons, resistance to imposed modernity. But post-development also has limits, that it can be vague, romanticizing, or impractical at large scales. A middle path emerges through skeptical post-development. The goal is radical democracy, empowering people, decentralizing power, and creating plural ways of living beyond Western models. The future lies in synthesis. Development and post-development must dialogue to create more just, I think something is wrong here. Maybe I skipped something. Development and post-development must dialogue to create more just, culturally grounded, democratic ways of improving life. Okay, so basically, as you can see here, I tried to make the information flow in such a way that before we move into the study guide, and we're going to breeze through the study guide because we've already built our foundations from what the article is about to how the assessment, what it wanted. Now, these summaries of the e-reserves are actually from the assessment, but I'm going to breeze through them very fast. It's 4 authors. So Peters's article, My Paradigm or Yours, is about alternative development, which tells us that it's participatory, people-centered, bottom-up approaches, how many aspects once considered alternative, and then have now been absorbed into mainstream development. So this article has information about alternative development. This article has information about post-development, and it tells us, it defines it as a radical rejection of development as Western technocratic ideological project, and it is associated with writers Esteva, Escobar, Sachs, and Landy. And then it mentions reflective development, which is a proposed alternative orientation in which development becomes self-critical, learning from its own failure, and focusing on social and political reflexivity. Overall, the article argues that development thinking is shifting. The old binary of mainstream versus alternative is no longer accurate. Post-development is powerful in critique, but weak in providing workable alternatives. The future lies in reflexive participatory development rather than full rejection. So how this article discusses PDT and its critiques is that Peterson shows that post-development theory is rooted in extreme disillusionment with the failures of development. And then how this PDT critiques development, the article explains that it views development as a malignant myth and failed project. that development is seen as a Western ideology, not a neutral process, and that it claims that development imposes Western modernity. Development equals cultural westernization, scientism, homogenization, bureaucratic control. And then it also mentions the Foucauldian discourse analysis, which states that development is treated as a power knowledge regime that produces third world as an object of control. It tells us that it rejects all reformist or alternative development models. PDT argues that alternative development is still development, thus also part of the problem. And then it advocates local, plural, grassroots resistance. This is what the article is telling us. And it emphasizes local knowledge, small-scale community autonomy, anti-globalization, and it rejects any universal project. It tells us that PDT is anti-modernity and anti-planning, preferring many small resistance over a large scale. So it also has criticisms leveled against PD theory by mainstream development discourse. So they talk about critique, but no alternatives, that it has no future programs and no constructive path beyond rejection. Yeah, so if you want to look at the criticisms of PDT, they're there in this article. And then it tells us that it homogenizes development. It tells us that Peterson argues that PDT makes the same mistake as modernization theory, that it treats development as a single uniform Western project, and it ignores differences within development. This article talks about romanticizing and it has a lot of information that we've mentioned earlier. I think just go back to this article and highlight the themes that we've been mentioning earlier, because we have quite a bit to go through and I don't want to get your brains tired. Peterson, go to that article for his critique. Go to that article for criticisms from main development discourse. So here, let's just read these. Actually, let me read this whole part. So Peterson's critique of PDT. PDT is powerful in criticism, but empty in construction. It romanticizes the local and demonizes modernity. It treats development as monolithic. It ignores empirical diversity in the South. It is politically and analytically weak. And then the criticisms from main development discourse, it says no alternatives offered. There's critique without solutions. It's overly simplistic, which reduces development to a fixed Western project. It romanticizes tradition and ignores inequalities in local communities. It is anti-modern and anti-science, undermining its own analysis. It is politically conservative, despite radical tone, and it is non-representative of Southern movements. Fine. So the Peterson 2000, also it has themes of rejection of development. It talks about the problematization of poverty, which tells us that post-development challenges the conventional understanding of poverty, arguing that subsistence economies are not inherently poor, but are labeled as such because they do not conform to market-based consumption, and poverty is viewed as a culturally and historically variable concept, and the representation of poverty is critiqued for being distorted and disempowering. And then it critiques the modern science. So the Peterson article also has unique critiques here. It critiques modernism and science, and then it mentions development as a discourse. It also has alternatives to development. It has information on alternatives to development. You might want to grab some. And then it talks about anti-managerialism, which is post-development critiques the managerial and interventionist nature of development, which often involves imposing external solutions on local communities, and it expresses an anti-authoritarian sensibility and skepticism towards organized politics and development institutions. Another one, it talks about dichotomous thinking, that post-development is criticized for its binary approach, categorizing development as either good or bad without acknowledging its complexities and dialects. This dichotomy is seen as oversimplifying the history and realities of development. And then it also mentions the politics of post-development. The political stance of post-development is characterized by resistance rather than transformation or emancipation. and that it emphasizes local struggles and grassroots movements, but lacks a clear constructive program of alternative to development. Here it gives examples of the grassroots movements. Like I said, you just have to look at the table. The table will guide you. I'm going to send it. I'm going to post it. Just see the table, and then you will see the local grass movements, the cultural critique, all of that stuff is there. Okay, so in conclusion, this document provided a comprehensive critique of post-development. It highlighted its rejection of traditional development paradigms and its focus on cultural, ecological, and grassroots perspectives. However, it also points out the limitations of post-development, including its lack of constructive alternatives, reliance on rhetorical strategies, and tendency toward dichotomous thinking. Ultimately, the document suggests that while post-development contributes to critical conversations about development, it fails to offer a viable political or a path forward. Okay, here I'm just going to read like a paragraph or two. So Esteva Prakash is another article. This one it's called Beyond Development What? So here it explains why development as a global project has become oppressive, destructive, and no longer credible, and it highlights a new social movements that create real alternatives outside the development system. And then it tells us below is a structured explanation using only content from the article. Okay, so development has failed and become a global myth. Esteva and Prakash argue that after four development decades, development has not improved life for the world's majority. Instead, it has become a malignant myth that has failed miserably and turned the global south into victims of a harmful experiment. They describe development as a world social experiment that created more inequality, cultural destruction, dependency, and poverty. The second one is development as an instrument of domination. They argue that development is not neutral. It is part of a global project driven by political and economic elites, especially in the industrialized North. Development works as a tool of economic colonization, a mechanism of cultural homogenization, a form of political control, and an extension of Western modernity and capitalist logic. And then they talk about how development creates marginality. This article explains that most people in the world have been turned into marginals or outsiders who are told they are not yet developed. Development creates a category of people defined only by lack, core, not yet, or not yet developed. This marginalization forces people into dependence on the state, markets, NGOs, or experts, undermining their own ways of living. It mentions the co-option of participatory development. In the 1970s and 1980s, people demanded popular participation. However, the article argues that elites soon co-opted participation, turning it into a technocratic tool used to legitimize development. Instead of empowering people, it expanded state bureaucracy and reinforced control. Then it talks about the grassroots resistance and new alternatives. This article celebrates how grassroots groups around the world have begun to reject development entirely and create their own locally rooted alternatives. These examples in the article include indigenous communities, peasant movements, cooperatives, and commons-based governance structures. The Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, which explicitly rejected development and demanded dignity, autonomy, and protection of community commons. Esteva and Prakash described this as an epic unfolding at the grassroots, where people are reinventing institutions, knowledge, and ways of life outside modern frameworks. Then it talks about grassroots postmodernism. The author introduces the idea of grassroots postmodernism, not the academic style, but a lived reality in which ordinary people create new social worlds beyond development and modernity. Okay, characteristics include reclaiming community, reviving local knowledge, creating commons-based economic systems, rejecting the belief that Western modernity is universal or superior. And then it's got the critique of the sacred cows of modernity. This article challenges three major sacred cows that upholds development. It's global thinking or economic rationality. This is development that imposes economic logic on all aspects of life. The other one is universal human rights. This is, while important, rights are used to reimpose Western moral frameworks and cultural domination. The third one is the modern individual self. Development promotes isolated individualism instead of community-centered ways of being. And then we'll move on to the next section, toward a future beyond development. The author concludes that the era of development is ending and a new era is emerging through grassroots movements, revived commons, local autonomy, culturally rooted ways of life, networks of mutual aid, resistance to neoliberal globalization. Development, they argue, is a dying global project, and the hope for the future lies not in reforming it, but moving beyond it. The article argues that development is a failed, harmful global project, and that true alternatives are already emerging from grassroots movements that are creating new, autonomous, culturally rooted ways of living beyond the logic of modernity and economic rationality. Okay. Okay. We've done this. This is just a, sorry, we already done this one. Sometimes I'm going to skip past, right? Okay. Let's go to Zia. The Zia 2004. Did I read the Zia 2004 article? The summary? Okay. No, we didn't. Post-development theory, explanation, critique of development and mainstream criticisms. So Zia's article 2004 explains what is post-development. Zia shows that post-development is not a single unified school, but a cluster of perspectives that share certain foundational ideas. Post-development thinkers, now it tells us about core elements. According to Escobar, cited by Zia as providing the clearest definition, post-development is characterized by development as a whole. I think now you guys know, the definition. It's from the study guide and it's everywhere in each article. The emphasis on local culture and knowledge, a critical stance towards scientific or scientistic development discourses, support for localized pluralistic grassroots movement. And then what does PDT reject? Post-development authors view development as a Eurocentric discourse shaping how the third world is perceived. It rejects an imperialist project for restructuring societies according to Western needs, and it rejects a meaningless amoeba-like concept that can be filled with any content, yet always harmful. It tells us that PDT challenges the very foundations of development thinking. Now we're going back again to the article's post-development critiques of development. Zia shows that PDT's critique of development operates on several levels. Development is a discourse of power. Development is historically developed as Eurocentric and imperialistic. Guys, the themes follow. I'm trying to find something unique. Because you've seen the Eurocentrism and imperialistic, so it's also applied in Zia. Let's now move to development produces dependency and harm. Post-development texts portray development as generating material and spiritual impoverishment, undermining traditional cultures. Development as a false promise. Development is dismissed as a mirage, a malignant myth that perceives people into believing Western progress is universal or achievable. Zia notes these rhetorical strategies explicitly. Development as a deceitful mirage or malignant myth. And then remember Zia's contributions of those two. Let me just remind you what they are: the skeptical post-development and the neo-populist. The information hasn't changed. Let's see the next article. Cultural, okay. It's in the table. All of the stuff is in the table, guys. It's in the table. Okay, Zia again explains post-development theory in the 2015 article. Zia identifies 5 major ways in which post-development theory critiques development, showing how the term development represents multiple overlapping power structures. So here, at least they tell us that they identify 5 major ways. You can go find out what those are, but they're here. Development is a Eurocentric discourse. Development is a failed historical project. Development as a homogenization and othering. Development is economization. Development is a legitimation and internal ambiguities in PDT. And then that's it for the assignment and all the articles. All the information is practically repetitive in different ways, but let's read the final. So post-development theory is a radical intellectual project that rejects development as a Eurocentric discourse, a failed historical experiment, a homogenizing hierarchy, a vehicle of capitalist economization, and a justification of technocratic domination, drawing authors from Escobar, Esteva, and Sachs. PTD argues that development constructs the global south as deficient and in need of Western guidance, while obscuring local agency, knowledge, and cultural diversity. However, mainstream development scholars have raised substantial criticisms of PDT. They argue that PDT romanticizes traditional societies, promotes cultural relativism, exhibits paternalism by prescribing a minimalist life for the poor, fails to offer viable alternatives, and suffers from methodological weaknesses. Critiques further emphasize that PDT ignores how Southern actors appropriate and modify development discourse for their own purpose. And then Zia concludes that both development and PDT were declared dead prematurely. Development remains embedded in global institutions, while PDT continues to haunt development theory. Its core insight about Eurocentrism, discourse, and power have been adopted even by its critics. Unfortunately, both strands converge around a shared normative goal: empowering marginalized groups to define their own pathways towards a good life outside authoritarian and Eurocentric models. Great. Now, I think we're done there. Now, here we're going to breeze through fast. So remember the enabling outcomes. Now we're going verbatim with the textbook. The enabling outcomes was we were supposed to, after working through this unit, we're supposed to be able to discuss the critiques of development. By we've done that. Like we've just spent 40 minutes discussing the critiques of development, as you guys probably are nodding. Discuss the criticisms, we've already done that. We've already discussed the criticism of post-development and analyzed the overall contribution of post-development to for the next 30 minutes, we're going to analyze the overall contribution of post-development to the struggle for a better life. Okay, so here, I'm not going to read the introduction. I'm not going to read what is post-development because we've already discussed it. I'm sorry, guys. Is there anyone who arrived late? If you arrived late, you just have to read, you just have to listen to the video. Okay, we can start. Let's just see here. What is post-development? No, we've already done this. We've already done this. We've already done this. We're going to move straight to the assignment. Okay, critical perspectives and post-development. Let me just see something. No, we've already done this. We've already done this. Come, let's go to the self-assessment activity. Okay, after reading the summary provided here above on Peter's assertions on post-development, highlight the key areas that discussion has noted as the weaknesses of the post-development theory. You do not require the link. So for this one, I used intelligence to give us a better answer than what we probably would have answered. But please do find your own answer anyways. Okay, based on the discussion in Learning Unit 2, post-development essentializes development, that the theory reduces the entire development field to a single, uniform, negative project, ignoring its diversity. Gaspar argues it caricatures the development field by simplifying its many ideas into one narrow meaning. So another weakness of the PDT is it repeats the same simplifications made by earlier Western Western development theories. The third weakness of the PD theory, Peterson states that the post-development repeats the crude, essentialist labeling of development found in old modernization theory, treating development as if it has a single and narrow meaning. It tells us that one of its other weaknesses, it lacks clear practical alternatives. If you remember earlier, we did discuss the fact that one of the articles criticized it and said it lacks practical alternatives. Although post-development criticizes development strongly, the objectives and alternatives remain vague and incomplete. The theory is still in the process of being formed. The other weakness is it leans towards managerialism and resistance rather than emancipation. So Peterson argues that the theory has a deep anti-managerial bias, ignoring many forms of practical action that could actually support liberation. This results in a politics of resistance. Okay, we now move on to the next part of the article. Of the study guide. In the more recent article, Peterson edition showing the part truth and part simplification of each of the pillars of post-development's critique of development. I'm so sorry. I have to decline. Sorry, I'm just putting my phone on silent. Okay. In a more recent article, Peterson, in addition to showing the part truth and part simplification of each of the pillars of post-development's critique of development, argues that it has a deep anti-managerialism which ignores many levels and forms of liberatory action, and this leads to a politics of resistance, not of emancipation. That will be found earlier again. It's there. We did discuss this. Okay. In the face of all these criticisms, what role remains for post-development? One answer to this question is provided by Zia. In a rather theoretical and dense article, Zia argues that to derive something valuable from post-development, two tendencies within post-development, one negative and one positive, must be distinguished. The negative tendency within post-development, according to Zia 2004, is to use it as a program of reactionary populism, where an anti-modernist and sometimes anti-democratic culturalism imbued with patriarchal values reinforces traditionalism and takes a conservative political stance. Zia contrasts this with another way of thinking within post-development, which is characterized by a systemic skepticism of existing power in order to support a project of radical democracy. In this way, skeptical post-development could be seen as a manifesto of democracy in the field of development policy and theory. Both tendencies must be acknowledged. Zia argues before a proper assessment of post-development can be made. Let's go to the next self-assessment activity. We're almost done, guys. So activity 2.2 told us to read that article. And this article is actually the ones with the comments. Note the key. Wait, let me see if it's the commons one. Okay. No, it's not the commons. Regarding the author's criticism that skeptical post-development is connected to project of radical democracy. Okay, so we're reading this article to note the key points regarding the author's criticism that skeptical post-development is connected to a project of radical democracy. Remember, the skeptical post-development was from those two theories that Zia came up with, or the models that they mention in the article. So now we're focusing on one of those models. So it tells us that it extends democratic struggles across society. These are all AI summary notes, guys. So please do not use them verbatim or else you'll be flagged. It extends democratic struggles across society. The Zia explains that skeptical post-development aligns with Laclau and Morph's view of the extension of the democratic struggles for equality and liberty to a wide range of social relations. He then shows that post-development similarly extends struggles for self-determination. Sorry, I'm just switching on the light. And self-determination into development policy and structures of modern society. Then it speaks about a critique of representative democracy. Skeptical post-development shares the radical democratic critique that representative democracy serves elite interests. Zia quotes from Esteva and Prakash, "In modern democracies, a small minority decides for the people. A minimal minority promulgates the laws and makes the important decisions." Then they mention the radical decentralization of power, which is political, economic, and epistemological. Zia shows both perspectives demand decentralization, citing Loomis. Democracy is a critique of centralized power of every sort. Skeptical post-development also calls for epistemological decentralization, challenging universal objective knowledge. And then the other pointer is the rejection, another note, rejection of universal truths and blueprints. Both radical democracy and skeptical post-development reject universal models of society. Zia cites Laclau and Mouffe. There is no radical and plural democracy without renouncing the discourse of the universal and its implicit assumption of a privileged point of access to the truth. Skeptical post-development therefore rejects universal prescriptions and supports plural, locally determined paths. And then there's the reformulating development discourse as oppression. Zia writes that skeptical post-development extends social conflictuality to the area of development policy and development aid through a reformulating relations of subordination implicit in development discourse as relations of oppression. And then it speaks about the constructivist, anti-essentialist view of culture. Skeptical post-development uses a constructivist understanding of culture. Culture is actively constructed, not fixed. This aligns with the radical democracy's rejection of essentialism and defense of
Hello? Boy, we can't hear you anymore. Or is it just me?
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
When did you guys lose me? After how many minutes? Because my computer was telling me that I'm reconnecting. Where was I? What is the last thing I said? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can, Boy.
Okay, so is it I don't know where last I was. So just read what you should have done for activity 2.1, right?
Yes, that's
So
where we were.
okay, fine. So this is how you should have tried to align the skeptical post-development. You know, so you should have first defined that skeptical post-development and source it from here, and then how it aligns with radical democracy. It says that it aligns with radical democracy because both challenge centralized and representative forms of power and call for deep political, economic, and epistemological decentralization. It says that it rejects universal models and the idea of a single truth, insisting instead on a plural, locally generated ways of organizing society. And then it says skeptical post-development reframes development discourse as a form of oppression, thereby expanding democratic struggles into development policy. And then tells us that it also adopts a constructivist view of culture, matching radical democracy's anti-essentialism. Thus, Zia argues that skeptical post-development can be seen as a manifesto of radical democracy within development studies. That was what was supposed to have been the answer there. I always try and test the answer against different sources. Sometimes I repeat because I get tired and then I end up repeating. Let's see this, if this is helpful. Let me see what this is. Okay, guys. So I'm just going to read the headlines. So the key points regarding the connection between skeptical post-development and project of radical democracy is it extends democratic struggles. No, this is exactly the same as before. I'm just going to move it slowly. We've done this. This is the same.
I don't think we're still sharing your screen, sorry.
Okay, you can't see. Okay.
No, there's nothing there.
How long has it been blank for now? It's a network. It's a network.
I'm not sure. But
Okay,
we can just go back to the place where you were talking about skeptical post-development model or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go back. Okay, I'm just trying to share. I'm just trying to share again. Sometimes network is very bad and it's beyond my control. Okay, so now I'm going to have to. Can you see something?
Not yet. Let's just wait a little bit. I'm not sure about the others. Maybe they can see. I can't see anything.
How long have you not seen for? 5 minutes?
Just after your yes, now I can see.
Okay, so you see Adobe.
Yes.
Here are the key points regarding. Okay, so basically I'm now going to allow you guys to read it as well. You can even try to short. I'm gonna hide it. Yeah. So these are the key points regarding the connection between skeptical post-development and the project of radical democracy. It talks about that Lecoq and Moff describe radical democracy as the extension of the democratic struggles for equality and liberty to a wide range of social relations. Similarly, skeptical post-development extends struggles for self-determination in the South to efforts aiming at development and various structures. It talks about the critiquing of representative democracy. Post-development critiques representative democracy, which is seen as serving elite interests. Esteva and Prakash argue that modern democracies allow a small minority to decide for the people, and they don't accept representative. You guys have heard that. Did you hear me talk about that earlier, right? Just before the thing cut. Or should I continue? Okay, but they accept representative democracy as an umbrella under which social movements can better struggle for autonomy compared to a dictatorship. Talks about a decentralization of power. Radical democracy emphasizes decentralizing power to the local level. Loomis states democracy is a critique of centralized power to every sort. Post-development aligns with this by advocating for political, economic, and epistemological decentralization. The other one is a challenge to the universal knowledge. Skeptical post-development challenges the notion of universal objective knowledge, which is seen as a tool for domination. Apfel Margolin notes that development is based on the premise that the world is objectively knowable, enabling experts to impose their knowledge globally. Post-development rejects this epistemological representation. And then it's a rejection of universal models. Both radical democracy and skeptical post-development reject universal models of society and universal descriptions of reality. They argue that imposing such models neglects pluralistic conceptions of a good society and different perceptions of reality. And they speak about the focus on social conflictuality. Skeptical post-development extends social conflictuality to development policy and aid by reformulating relations of subordination implicit in development discourse as relations of oppression. This critique is not limited to economic issues, but includes culture and knowledge, the perception of some countries as developed and underdeveloped. And then it talks about a respect for cultural diversity. Specialist post-development emphasizes respect for cultural diversity and prohibits generalizations. Rist states there are numerous ways of living a good life, and it is up to each society to invent its own. This aligns with the radical democratic perspective, which distrusts foundational knowledge and politics. And then it finally talks about the rejection of authoritarian politics. Laclau and Moff argue that the interweaving of science and politics leads to authoritarian politics. Skeptical post-development critiques this by rejecting universal blueprints and emphasizing pluralistic conceptions of society. And then, in summary, skeptical post-development aligns with radical democracy by challenging centralized power, rejecting universal models, promoting decentralization, emphasizing cultural diversity with self-determination. It seeks to extend democratic struggles to development policy and theory, emphasizing the importance of pluralism and autonomy. And then that was that. That was that exercise. Now, again, we're back to the study guide. We're almost finished. The debate on post-development has progressed. A decade later, Zia concluded that the Bureau of Development by post-development was inconclusive because the concept of development is still widely used. ODA, which is the Overseas Development Aid, is still flowing, and the desire for a Western middle-class lifestyle is still predominant in most of the world. At the same time, many of the approaches of post-development now appear in mainstream development discourse. In more recent writings, according to Zia, Peterson agrees that the discourse of development is Eurocentric, produces economism and relations of power and domination, and has an ideological function for Western hegemony. In this later article, Zia concludes that supporters of post-development and critics of post-development who support development should join to devise theories and strategies of how to fight global inequality and achieve a good life for all in a non-Eurocentric and non-authoritarian manner. And finally, I think this is the last exercise before we call it the day. And this one is activity 2.3, entitled Post-Development, Premature Burials and Haunting Ghosts, which is located at, you've seen that one. Okay, so I asked Pilot to do this one for us because I was like, this one is gonna be fast and sorry, I just wanna. Okay, so in this activity, the premature burial of development, the exact words from the article, Zia explains that post-development authors announce that the age of development is coming to an end. The time is ripe to write its obituary. Esteva even compared development to an unburied corpse. Post-development argued that development had failed, caused more inequality, and lost credibility. But Zia shows this burial was premature because ODA still flows, development is still widely used, and the desire for a Western middle-class lifestyle is still predominant. Now, explaining the above is post-development writers claimed development had died, but Zia shows that development actually still exists. AIDS is still there, the idea is still used everywhere, and people still want a modern lifestyle. So PD buried development too early. Okay, again, Zia in the article, The Ghost of Development in Post-Development. Zia writes that PD criticized development for being shapeless and amoeba-like, able to be filled with virtually any content. But ironically, PD also reproduced the same ambiguity. Their criticism of the concept was also ridden with ambiguity concerning their target, as if the ghost of the concept they wanted to bury came back to haunt them. Okay, so this is telling us that PD says development is vague and unclear, but in their own writing, they attack many different things, all under the name development. So the ghost of the messy concept is still haunted PD. Then the premature burial of post-development. Mainstream theorists try to bury PD, calling it seriously flawed, misconceived, and based on essentialism and pathos. But Zia shows this burial was premature too. Many academic authors, sorry, can I please tell my dog to shut up? I'm so sorry. Louis, shut up. Okay, the premature burial of post-development. Okay, so okay, we've read the first sentence, but Zia shows this burial was premature too. Many academic authors did not share the view that PD debate is obsolete and used it in research. Publishers even issued new editions of classical PD texts. So this is basically telling us that scholars said PD was dead, but PD survived. Researchers still use it. New editions of PD books are published, and textbooks now include PD. So PD was also buried too early. The ghost of post-development and development theory. Zia argues development theory is haunted by PD ideas. Even PD critics repeat PD arguments. For example, Nederveen Pieterse criticizes development theory for Eurocentrism, Western hegemony, and producing relations of power and domination. This mirrors PD critiques closely. There are striking parallels between the two, and critics agree to most of its central tenets. Okay, let's explain this. PD's opponents rejected PD publicly, but quietly opted many PD ideas: Eurocentrism, power structures, critique of Western models. So the ghost of PD continues influencing development theory. Okay, so now in summary, post-development authors claimed that development had ended and should be buried, comparing it to an unburied corpse. Zia shows this was premature because development is still widely used, ODA continues to flow, and the desire for a Western middle-class lifestyle remains strong. And then although PD criticized development as an amoeba-like and shapeless concept, PD itself reproduced this ambiguity by attacking many different things under the same label. Thus, the ghost of development still haunted PD thinking. And lastly, critics condemned PD as flawed and obsolete, but this burial was also premature. As many scholars continue to use PD, new editions of PD classics have been published. This is all verbatim from the book. Development theorists who rejected PD nevertheless adopted many of its key arguments about Eurocentrism, Western hegemony, and power. Thus, PD's central ideas continue to haunt and influence mainstream development theory. Okay. Okay, this is our final one. With the passage of time, Esteva, by contrast, has continued to argue for a separate post-development space, which is outside and beyond the capitalist market and the consumer values of modernity. Heartened by the new protests of the indignados in Spain in 2011, protests in Argentina, the huge presence of Via Sina, 2011 militancy of the Occupy Wall Street movement, Esteva outlines a different path using a commons-based economy, radical democracy, rejecting formal democracy, and a convivial use of technology that, in the words of Ivan Illich, serve politically related individuals rather than managers. This all requires an ongoing revolution in the mode of the Zapatistas. No vanguards, no leaders, no parties. Horizontal grassroots organizations, commotion instead of promotion, ordinary folks doing extraordinary things. Okay,
So what's the last thing it tells us to do? This is the other activity. It said Esteva's 2014 article is a reflection on the ideas of a post-development vision to the economy, democracy, industry, and revolution. Make a short assessment of whether Esteva has successfully outlined a viable path, which is distinct from development and not haunted. What I did was I removed all the evaluation. I will leave you guys to evaluate by yourselves. I just gave the information. I removed all the evaluations because I think this is where we need to apply our understanding, you know. So this is some of the information that was given from that article. Esteva is one of the leading figures in post-development theory, which critiques mainstream development as a Western-imposed project that often undermines local autonomy and destroys commons. In this article, he argues that commoning is the practice of collectively creating and maintaining shared resources and relationships, offers a foundation for a new society beyond development. His central claim, development has been a war against the commons and recovering commoning is the way forward. Okay, the strengths, distinctiveness from development. So because it's an evaluation, it has to have strengths and weaknesses. So the strengths were the rejection of the growth logic. Esteva clearly distances commoning from the development paradigm, which is obsessed with economic growth. The focus on relationships and not resources. By saying commoning is not about resources, but about relationships, he shifts the emphasis away from material accumulation towards social bonds. This is a radical departure from development metrics. And then it talks about the plurality of paths. Commoning is inherently diverse and localized. Unlike development, which imposes a universal model, commoning allows communities to invent their own ways of living. And then one of the strengths is embedded in lived practices. Esteva grounds his vision in real-world practices, indigenous traditions, grassroots movements, not abstract policy frameworks. This makes it more distinct from development's top-down planning. And then the limitations of this was the risk of romanticization by idealizing commoning. Esteva sometimes glosses over the conflicts, the exclusions, and inequalities that can exist within commons, ambiguity of scale. Commoning works well at local levels, but Esteva does not fully explain how it could address global challenges such as climate change, migration, pandemics, without engaging with larger institutions. The other limitation is dependence on development ruins. His vision emerges as a response to development's failure. In that sense, it is still haunted by development because commoning is framed as recovery from what development destroyed. So is it haunted by development? Is it yes or no? Or partially? If it's yes, Esteva defines commoning in opposition to development, which means development remains the shadow against which his vision is articulated. His language, war against the commons, shows that development is still the reference point. But then he says no. By emphasizing relationships, autonomy, and plurality, he sketches a horizon that does not rely on development's categories, progress, modernity, poverty, elevation. Commoning is not a new version of development, but a different ontology about being and relating and not achieving growth. Okay. Viability of Esteva's path, the strengths. Grounded in practice, Esteva points to existing commons, community land, cooperative economies, indigenous traditions as evidence that commoning is already viable. He resonates with global movements. His ideas align with degrowth, eco-villages, solidarity economies, and indigenous resurgence, showing broader viability. Ethical appeal. The emphasis on care, reciprocity, and shared responsibility make commoning morally compelling. And the weaknesses is institutional blind spot. He does not fully address how commoning interacts with the state, market, or global governance. Risk of marginalization.
Without institutional support, commons can be vulnerable to enclosure, exploitation, or co-optation. And then the scalability challenge. While commoning works locally, it is unclear how it could replace development as national or global scale. And then that was it. This is just his exact words. See, using his exact words. But we're literally done. That was 2.4. That was the final of this PDT theory. I'm sure everybody now kind of understands that PDT it constantly critiques development. And like in the articles, we saw the strengths and weaknesses of the PDT. Now it's up to you to actually make notes or and then reference, and then you do for the development, the critiques by other authors of it and things like that. But if you use, like I said, if you use that table from the beginning, you're going to be okay for this question. And this brings us to the close of our meeting. So I give you guys some time. I wish you luck. This was the final unit for this module, and I'm sure you guys are going to do very well because you've got enough information. We really went deep into trying to understand exactly what we're supposed to know about PD, and I hope that you don't panic. And is there anybody that wants to say anything before we close the meeting? We got a minute or
Hi,
two.
Fuyo.
Hi.
So one thing that I noticed, right, when we were going through this topic is we were told to look for critiques of post-development, critique
Mm,
of post-development towards development, right?
mm.
And then when we were looking at all the critique of post-development, they never mentioned anything about the contributions of post-development towards the development discourse.
Okay.
If you noticed that, so that's one other maybe section that people can actually go into and look for. Why I say so is I recognized the test paper, one of the test papers that people shared, there was a
Mm.
similar question that was implying to that. It was implying that you should state or describe the contributions that post development has made to the development discourse.
Oh, yes. So that one, I hear what you're saying.
Mm.
Maddie, we kind of did, there is, I think one of the authors, I'm going to just clarify, but it would be good to get an article that merges both of them, like you said, like that merges, basically integrating them. Is that what you're trying to say? An article that integrates them.
Not really integrating them, but we were shown, or we read about the critique of
Yeah,
post development, but we
yeah.
we didn't read about its contributions to the development discourse. So if it makes sense to me, I tend to wonder, okay, why is it that they didn't give us that?
Okay. Can you please send me that question after class?
Okay, I'll do. But anyway, I also went further and looked for those. So I actually found out there's an article by Prosa 2010.
Yeah.
He spoke about those contributions to the development discourse. So maybe people can actually go and look for more
Mm.
of those contributions to the development discourse, and look for other authors that talk about post development contributions to the current development discourse.
Okay. The
Yes.
current development discourse. Okay, yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And how maybe the post development discourse has contributed to sustainable development. Remember, that's the main theme when it comes to this module.
Okay. When now the minute you talk about sustainable development, right? For me,
Mm.
my brain goes back to the other units. It goes back to the economic, the social. So already I already know it's commoning. I
Yeah.
already associate the article that I'm going to get the type of information from. If I'm going to tie it to development, I'm going to tie it to the commenting article, which is Esteva, right?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Now the other one, say it again. The other one, the exam question one, the one where you said,
You know what?
let me see.
I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, but
Ah,
I remember they were asking to give the to give post development contributions to
ah.
the development discourse.
Okay, exactly. You know what, Mandy? I think that's what I wanted to do. That was one of the things I wanted to do. Now that you're talking about it, I need to exactly. I thought about what you're saying. I thought about this
Because
in the first sentence.
if you look at the material that we got
Yes,
from the
exactly.
topic,
Mm,
that part is not there.
precisely. Which is
That
why
part is not there. So they will definitely ask about those things that you tend to
okay.
overlook.
Okay, sorry, can I just ask something here? Let me just ask intelligence about development discourse quickly. The best articles to get.
Mm.
Let me just get it on the screen so that you guys can you guys see what I'm doing? Can you
Yeah,
see?
can.
Yeah. Let me just quickly get you guys the articles, okay? You'll just screenshot. Is it frozen? Is it frozen? Is it frozen? Oh yeah. Guys, it looks like it. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm just waiting for it. Okay. Because I don't want to share it to the big group. I just want to share it with the people that are here. That explain. Yeah, Mandy, can you please repeat the thing about development discourse? I
we're
typed.
just we're just looking for post development contributions towards the development
Not
discourse.
post development.
Yeah.
We're only looking for development discourse, not post,
Was
right?
we're saying post development contributions towards the development discourse. Okay, maybe I can give you an example of those
Let's explain
contributions. Yes,
contributions of PDT to development discourse, ne?
yes,
Is that what you're saying?
yes. So one of them says post development theory advocates for empowering local communities to take charge of their own development. So this means that it emphasizes on inclusion of locals in identifying their own social issues and solutions,
Mm,
utilizing local knowledge and cultural values to design and implement development projects, and promoting grassroots movements and community-based initiatives, especially from the global south, in creating new discourses. So
mhm.
you can actually tell what the development discourse is doing. It's promoting what we call the bottom up approach.
Yeah,
Yes. So
okay.
such things, you have to identify those things. What is it that it's doing that is a bit different from maybe the mainstream development discourse?
Oh, shoot. Why did I stop the response? Sorry, my computer was freezing.
Okay.
Oh, I want to regenerate. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm listening to you.
Okay. And maybe another point could be that post development calls for alternative to development rather than alternative development. Mhm. This involves reflecting the existing development model entirely and seeking new ways to gain social change, thereby prioritizing local autonomy, cultural diversity, and sustainability. that's another contribution that the post development is making.
Okay.
Yes.
So, okay, fine. So now I'm going to quickly copy this on the screen so that we can go through it together. And
Okay.
then you guys screenshot where you need to, because why I like Copilot. Copilot finds articles very quickly. No, I don't want to go in articles very quickly. Sometimes articles work. I ask videos and YouTubes, and which helps me like. And I've only been using this thing for 4 weeks now, just for studying. I have never used it before. Okay, Mandy. So here we are. I'm trying to get this thing copied onto the page, né? So that we're able to read it. I'm going to ask you to make it into a table form, okay? So that it's easier, because tables much easier than writing. That's how my brain. And then that way, we can also screenshot from the computer. It's just that my computer is getting slow, and I need to switch it off eventually. Okay, so I'm just waiting for it to summarize. It's still okay. Sometimes it takes long. Okay, let me just. Okay. It's really delaying, guys. I'm gonna have to. It's okay. Sorry, let me quickly just do Control Alt and Delete quickly. Okay, wait. I think you're gonna lose me again. My computer's frozen. Okay, let me just say Control Alt and Delete. This is why I hate computers, because sometimes I need to clean my computer this week. Okay,
I hope
today.
it doesn't. It
Yeah, I'm just
doesn't
trying to.
on you when you're in the exam.
That's what it did years ago, and it set me back. I remember I had to rewrite that, and then I rewrote it, and I got 78% 2 years ago. So it actually helped me. It was a blessing. Oh, sorry. Did I log out?
No, you're still here.
Okay, because I'm trying to get this thing to copy. Oh.
Are we still together? Hello?
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so I'm using my
Yes.
phone. I'm sorry about this. Let me quickly stop the recording. That's the first thing I want to do. So that I'm using my phone. Let me just stop the recording. Okay, fine. So for now, let me just see if it works. I'm so sorry.